Today is the last day, the final lecture for the final overview of the module for the final week of the course until you finish with your final exam. So if you made it this far, congratulations. Hope everything goes well for you. I'm sure it will if you've made it this far. This video is an overview of the last module, the last chapter of the textbook, and your readings for this week, which has to do with Reconstruction. Because last week you went over the works on the Civil War, more great cataclysmic events in American history. This week's on Reconstruction, which is the aftermath of that conflict. When the North has triumphed, they basically forced the South into a settlement, into a surrendering, I should say, which they do, of course, in April 1865. And the nation in the aftermath of this, I mean, it's in ruins because the South is in ruins. They literally wiped out all of its infrastructure, destroyed a lot of it, and it leaves, of course, the nation's still bitterly divided. They had to sort of, and we'll get to this more in a second, by force bring the Confederacy, the former Confederate states, back into the Union. But it's also, as the Civil War was, a constitutional problem as well, because there was no provision in the Constitution either for secession or for readmitting states back into the Union after some sort of conflict like this. So you're in a historically unprecedented situation for obvious reasons of the war and its unprecedented nature, but also for the constitutional problem. And one of the most important things about Reconstruction is that it marks the beginnings, and again, people argue endlessly about what modern means, and I tend to think that, you could say that the United States from the beginning is a modern nation, but in terms of the modern nation as we understand it and know it, it really in some ways begins with the aftermath of the Civil War. Why? You've seen, of course, in this course that the United States was a political union before it was ever a unified society. It was never a single social unit in a lot of ways. And the process of creating fully a nation was already underway before the Civil War. But what happens in the aftermath of that, because the North's victory gave the federal government a free hand to create national policies in a way no government had been free before. You'd always had, again, state interests, sectional interests to block these things because, and you're going to see this, Reconstruction is a military thing as much as anything else. The federal government occupies the South, militarily speaking, and for the first time, the federal government can experiment in a social sense. Because, of course, part of the justification of the war, ever since the Emancipation Proclamation, was to get rid of slavery. As you're going to see, that was more difficult than I think that most people in the North had anticipated. And as you're going to see, it's going to be a touchstone for a lot of our modern debates about the role of the federal government, race relations, everything. It's really important for all those sorts of reasons. And so marks the creation point, the beginning point of our creation of our nation day as we understand it in a real direct way. You can mark it from the Reconstruction era. And so a quick overview of all this. The first thing your chapter is going to talk about in the textbook is approaches to Reconstruction. And at the end of the war, even before the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln is working to bring the South back in on fairly generous terms. His plan is the so-called 10% plan. Basically, when 10% of the population of a state has voted to come back into the Union, to accept the terms of the Constitution, to accept the abolishment of slavery, they'll get back into the Union. He is fighting with his own party, actually, at the end of the war. It is the Republicans. And remember, the Republicans, think of the political background here in the middle of the war. The Democrats were mostly in the South before the war, so the Republicans control everything in government. And so they have a free hand. There are a lot of people, we'll come to this in a second, in the Republican Party, former abolitionists, who now, two things. One, they want to punish the South, understandably. And then two, they want to remake the South in the North's image. So we'll come back to this in a second. And they basically pass a bill, a Reconstruction bill, admitting the states back into the Union, which Lincoln sort of vetoes and lets this bill sort of die, doesn't sign it. Before, in fact, of course, he is assassinated. the week after Appomattox, by John Wilkes Booth in 1865, which changes the dynamic because then his vice president becomes president, who is Andrew Johnson. If you know who Andrew Johnson is, he was actually a Southerner, a Tennessee Democrat, a Union Democrat who supported the Union during the war, and he's put on the presidential ticket in 1864 by Lincoln because, if you remember in 1864, he's in trouble politically. And so he needs to unify the country as much as possible. And so they create a national unity ticket. It's something you don't hear about in American politics much. That's more of a European thing. But in order to reunite the party, again, it was a real chance Lincoln could have been defeated in 1864. He gets on the ticket. And Johnson was, among other things, came from a poor white background in the South, hated slave owners. Again, you remember those divisions in the South before the war. Poor white farmers didn't really necessarily like the slave-owning classes, and he was among them. That's why he joined the Union and stayed loyal to them throughout the war. He was, however, also a white supremacist. And this is important because it affects his view of Reconstruction. Once Lincoln dies, and at the time of Lincoln's death, and time Johnson comes to the presidency, the South is reeling. It's basically, they're terrified. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know. Remember General Sherman, as he's marching south, is promising that they're going to give former Confederates lands to slaves. They're not sure. They're not sure what's going to happen to them. And so they're in a real bad way when Lincoln's assassinated. When Johnson comes to the presidency, he begins basically, and his requirements for reentry in the Union are not very steep. Basically, the former Confederate officers have to swear an oath to the Constitution, and this is one of the big sticking points between him and, say, Lincoln's plan and the Republicans in Congress. They don't want to readmit any former Confederate office holders, Confederate people who served in the Confederate Army for obvious reasons. They were traitors in their eyes. They just fought this bloody war. But Johnson gives them fairly easy way back in. And this changes things. Because as you're going to see, within the next several months after he takes office, starts doing that, once he begins to sort of send the signals out that it's okay for these Confederates to come back into government, they begin reasserting their control in the South with these former Confederate officers and politicians. Which means, my point is that if Lincoln's plan or Republicans' plan had gone into effect earlier, things might have gone differently. Because once it seems like, once the South gets the message that they're not going to have to change too many things, their resistance to change will stiffen. And for obvious reasons, look, they've lost a bloody war. There's, I mentioned before last time that the North's, some of its policies were brutal in many ways. So they have some legitimate beefs, but they were willing probably to submit to a lot more than they were until Johnson gets into power. And he almost immediately, by the way, begins falling out with Congress, who, of course, they're Republicans. He's a Democrat. But in particular, they reject his soft handling of the South. They also begin to assert their authority over the South. They pass a Reconstruction bill, which this begins the period we call Radical Reconstruction, over his vetoes, by the way. Again, the Republicans have enough control in Congress to veto everything, and they do. And so they take control of policy, and they divide the South up into 5 military districts. Again, Reconstruction is a military occupation. So if you're wondering one of the reasons why, the South's, okay, you lost the war, it's supposed to be slavery, why don't they just submit to, giving blacks equal rights? They're being occupied by a foreign power, which, again, one of the things you should be clear about here is there was no way they were going to give blacks equal rights unless they were militarily occupied. You'll see that in the chapter very clearly. But it just adds to the resistance. But the radical Republicans, they're open about this. They want to use this opportunity to reshape the South in the North's image, to turn what was an agrarian economy into an industrial one, to make it socially and economically speaking like the North. And so this is, and I'll get to this in a moment, this is not just, reuniting the nation, this is recreating it in their minds. And that's why it's called Radical Reconstruction. I'll come back to that in a moment. And in fact, by the way, you're going to read in the textbook, it'll mention this. There was a report, you can find this on the internet pretty easily, by a Union general named Carl Schurz, whom Johnson had actually sent to the South to go and gather information about public opinion, about what the South was willing to do and what it wouldn't. in order to be reunited to the rest of the states. And he's the one. This gets resurrected by historians in the 20th century, which I'll come back to. But he's the one who identified this before anyone else. That basically, unless you totally reconstruct the South, they're never going to accept the verdict. They accept the verdict of the war. Right after the war, Ulysses Grant went to the South and toured the South. And I'm trying to remember this off the top of my head, but he basically said the Southerners, though they didn't, obviously the war was a devastating thing, the loss, but they accepted it as the sort of judgment of the highest court they could appeal to, that is to the Almighty Himself. They accepted the outcome of the war. They did not accept the outcome of, I wouldn't say slavery, but they did not accept that it was fought, to establish things like equality of blacks and whites at all. And Carl Schurz's insight was, unless you reconstruct their economy and their society, none of this political reconstruction is going to make much of a difference. And in the end, that's how it turns out, by the way. And so also talk about, the textbook, the experience of freedmen during Reconstruction, because you're going to have efforts by Republican governments in the South. And again, to be clear about this, it's not until the Union Army's gone that former Confederate office holders are allowed to come back in and govern these states. So all these states are governed by Republican governments, who are voted in, by the way, with the help of African Americans. They can vote for the first time, and it's their votes that allow them in. And for the first time, you have African Americans building openly their own communities in the South. However, one of the major things they're going to encounter is that again, Southern politicians, Southern landowners are going to reinstitute a sort of economic form of subordination for them, even though the South, the northern governments, the federal government, the Republican governments try to make efforts to increase things like industry and things like this. The South remains an agricultural place for a long time afterwards. And in fact, even the former slaves themselves, they expect to get land. They don't expect to become. They don't have the skills or education to become industrial laborers, or they don't have the education. We'll talk about education in a second, but they don't have that. They don't expect that. And so there's almost a tension between the North and the people they're trying to help to a certain degree in the South. But you have the reintroduction of gang labor gangs, even though you'll see this in the textbook, what I mean by that, of a system that looks like slavery, even though it's not technically legal in a sense. That'll be returned. You'll have a system of sharecropping, where again you have a system where landowner owns the land, the tenants work the land in order to give him a part of and they give him a part of their produce or whatever to stay on the land. But it's a pretty iniquitous system, and it more or less exists to keep people in subordination this way. And in fact, by the way, this exists for whites as well as blacks in the South. My great-grandfather was actually a sharecropper in Jacksonville, Florida, if you can imagine. So pretty widespread, and it keeps the South, again, kind of backward in terms of not having a lot of heavy industry and other opportunities, economically speaking. And of course, the thing that they do almost immediately within a year of Reconstruction, year after the end of the war, is wherever they can, they actually get blotted out by Republican governments. You have black codes being passed, which, as the name implies, there are codes that are meant to restrict the rights of blacks in the South. You'll read some of these. Should have some of these sources in the Major Problems Reader for this week. But you also have the building of black communities, and one of the things the textbook will mention, and it's actually true, there are some positive achievements that occur in Reconstruction. For the first time, blacks can own their own land, they can build their own businesses, they can build their own schools, which they do with the help of Northern reformers and other people from the North trying to help them out. A lot of times, actually, with help from black leaders from the North who came to the South for the purpose of trying to set things up in the South. The idea was racial uplift. That's the phrase people used in the 19th century. And it had some success, by the way. Not only, I mentioned philanthropic activities, but you had a lot of missionaries, both black and white, Christians who came from the North and the South to do things like build schools, build churches. And they had success. The literacy rate among blacks in the South went from 5% in 1870 to 70% by 1900. And so you do have some success in these regards. You also have some success by the Republican governments to try to give them a leg up, if you like. There were some efforts to try to desegregate public facilities, although, again, for the most part, most black parents, for obvious reasons, favored segregated schooling to keep them away from hostile whites. This is also, of course, the era of the Freedmen's Bureau in the South. This is the bureau that's set up by the Republican governments of the 1860s to help freedmen on economic matters and establish schools for African Americans. They established African American universities and colleges throughout the South. And modern historians especially are very, they're approving of, for the most part, of Reconstruction governments in the South, Republican governments. They passed social welfare programs, calling for more hospitals, humane prison systems and asylums. They build railroads in the South, build roads throughout the South. And you generally have a fairly, again, modern historians tend to take a fairly positive line on this because they see it as progressive in social terms. But all this, of course, is undone in the South. And what undoes this basically is two things. One is you have by the time you get to the 1870s, a sense of exhaustion in the North. Partly because this costs a lot. I mean, you're having full armies in the field in every southern state to try to prevent violence. We'll come to that in a moment. That's the main reason. But in the North, a depression hits in the early 1870s, economic depression. And all of a sudden, Northerners are just sort of fed up with the cost of it. You have people campaigning against this. In the North, are called classical liberals. That term may have some meaning for you. Classical liberals are what are essentially today's modern conservatives. They're for small government. They're for low spending. And most of these people were pulling out of the South. There's an increasing sentiment for this before it actually occurs in 1877. But the main reason is you have what amounts to an insurgency campaign perpetrated by Southern whites and leaders in the white community who resort to violence, both against blacks, but also white Southern collaborators, but also Northern whites who come down there, so-called carpetbaggers. And this is, of course, referring to the Ku Klux Klan, whose increasingly violent attacks take their toll in the South. And when I say violent attacks, I'm using the word insurgency for a reason. We're talking about pitched battles in certain states, almost like war, between Union troops and what are essentially former Confederate soldiers going and fighting them off. In some places, brutal fighting in South Carolina, in Louisiana. And it's this that begins to sort of force a general, it'd be President Grant in the 1870s to say, look, they don't have the stomach for it. Politically speaking, it's costly, and you put it this way, you'd have to put more troops in there. You'd have to commit more troops, and for a long time. It's not going to change overnight by then. And so what happens is by 1876, you have this very closely contested election between Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, in which there's basically a few states whose elections are contested, mostly in the South. And what happens is you have a disputed election. A committee is set up in the neither one wins a majority in the electoral college. It just goes to the House. They decide who wins the election. They set up a committee, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats, to decide whether or not, who won the votes in those states. Well, the Republicans said that Hayes won them. Democrats said that Tilden won them. You have two sets of votes. And so what happens is the Republicans essentially make a deal with the southern states. They will, in exchange for allowing Hayes to be elected, they will pull the last Union troops out of the South, which when that happens, of course, that's basically it in terms of trying to safeguard black rights, trying to safeguard their legal and political equality, and hence lead to the end of what we call Reconstruction. So that's the overview of the narrative of this. You'll learn more about it in the chapter in the primary sources, which I won't go through in too much detail this week. They'll talk about everything that I'm talking about. And I think I gave you one essay which is pretty interesting on this. I believe it's the essay on memory, I think. but a good one on the whole. Um, in terms of the place of Reconstruction in our national life. But I want to go for a minute of the historiography of this, because Reconstruction has been viewed in very different ways since it ended in 1877. From the late 19th century to the late 19th century, early 20th century, up to the 1960s, most historians, I mean historians, when we talk about historians, talk about historians in the Northeast, took a very dim view of Reconstruction, as they took a very negative view of it. They thought of it as being this unjust imposition on a defeated South. They blamed carpetbaggers, Republican governors, and freed slaves for leading to all this violence and stuff that happened in the South. And this was fed by racist attitudes in the period. This is sometimes referred to, by the way, as the Dunning School, because of a historian at Princeton named William Dunning, who saw Reconstruction as largely an immoral imposition on conquered Southerners. This only changed in the 1960s for reasons that should be obvious to you. It's a result of the social changes and the social upheaval of the 1960s. And these historians took a very different line, of course. They refuted the idea that Southerners had accepted the Reconstruction. One of the sort of shibboleths of the earlier historiography was that Southerners would have accepted Reconstruction if it hadn't been imposed upon them. I think we can all safely say this is not the case. At least if they had not, most historians think that if the Union had put their foot down immediately and really harshly, they might have submitted. Because otherwise you couldn't, the South, you had to really break them, and they didn't do that. And these, call them revisionist historians, revisionist interpretations of the Reconstruction in the 1960s, they stress the achievement of black politicians and Republican state governments in that period. Again, today's historians contend, for the most part, that these governments were progressive. They were reformers in terms of education, family law, social services, commerce, so on and so forth. They generally see it as they saw these 1960s historians did Reconstruction as a sort of success to a certain degree. The only thing that's really changed since then is that most historians writing today generally they agree with the revisionist interpretation that these Republican governments wanted to do these good things, that the South was recalcitrant. They were the reason why, for the most part, that Reconstruction failed. But they're less sure about the achievements of Reconstruction governments. Eric Foner is the big historian who's worked on this. And again, as you get a sense of, by the way, what I'm talking about, most of these historians are politically speaking on the left. They're progressives. And they see this basically as a revolution that never got started. They actually go back to Carl Schurz. It's Foner who resurrected Carl Schurz's report in the 1960s. And so does a blueprint for what should have happened. They should have used the power of the government to totally reshape the South, and they didn't do it. And one other way, by the way, one other interesting way historians have talked about Reconstruction, and only in the last few years, there've been some good books published on this, is that some historians see Reconstruction as the first attempt at the United States venturing into nation building. That is to say, this isn't just a reunion of the states with back into the Union or whatever. They see it as something that's analogous with, but also in continuity with, the efforts of the U.S. government in the 20th century to if you like, nation build in countries like Japan, the Philippines, and of course, what they're really thinking about, these historians, is modern-day Iraq, and they make that comparison explicit. They see this as the federal government's first attempt to, as a continuation of its military intervention, which you can obviously see the parallels when you think about it. We're going to, go into it's not just, once the slaves are freed by Lincoln, it's not just about, keeping the Union together. It's about, making people free in the South. But like, of course, that modern conflict in Iraq, it gets sort of undermined by an insurgency. The question becomes, can you nation build like that? Can you use military power to reshape a society? Even if it's possible. It may not be possible, and of course, it brought about that sort of same conflict. And again, I don't mean to make total comparisons, but I should point out that the situation in Iraq, in the South, after the U.S. government pulls out in 1877 is not so dissimilar to the position of, I would say, Middle Eastern Christians today in Iraq. They were basically at the mercy of people who hated them, and thousands of blacks in the South will be lynched in the ensuing decades. They really are at the mercy of people who use terrorism to keep them in line in many ways, in many respects. It's that bad to a certain degree. Not everywhere and not all the time and not for all time, but there's a parallel to be drawn there. Again, not the most pleasant thing to end the semester with, is it? But it's actually, there is something to this, this idea that the federal government wants to, and it's not just, by the way, it's about a couple of things. One, we're going to make these people more economically like us, because we're going to have a big market. You'll see this in the Reconstruction chapter in the textbook. One of the things the Republicans want to do is create a true national market. It's not, those sectional ties they thought were a barrier to this before the war. And so now they're going to create, and they have to do it by destroying things, is the thing you should keep in mind. In the same way that, the United States think, well, we're going to create a global market. To get the sense by now, if you pay attention to world news, that not everybody likes this. And we've had to sort of force it on people. And the same thing goes with, of course, we're going to give them freedom. Can you give them freedom at the point of a gun? So something to keep in mind. I thought, and there's been some good books. There's especially a good book on Reconstruction in Louisiana, which, again, I mentioned those pitched battles. One of the more dramatic ones occurred in Louisiana between the Union Army there and former Confederate soldiers. Dramatic stuff, not unlike what's going on, like I said, in Iraq today. And so that's my little overview of the historiography. That is it. That's all I've got for you. Hope you had a great semester. I hope this was of some value to you. I want to thank everybody, by the way, and you have this last week, I think you have, or the next week, I guess, to leave feedback one more time. Your feedback has been very helpful. I will definitely use it to make changes to my course. Coming in, I'm teaching in the summer, by the way, so I'll do that. Thank you all for a good semester. Thank you guys for your efforts and trying to continue to learn. I appreciate it. And by the way, a little plug for my courses. I am teaching two in the summer. Mostly they're almost filled up. So one's a world history course from the ancient world to about 1500. The other is, I believe it's the same course, so you wouldn't want to take that one twice. I am teaching 3 courses in the fall, only one of which I think 2 of them were the same course you've just taken, but one is the continuation. It's an online course. It's American History 2, so if you want to take that course with me, by all means, it's open for signups now. I'd love to have you again. Again, have a great summer. Keep learning, keep invested in history, and hopefully if you see me around campus, say hi, and I'll try to see how you've been. So take care.